Welcome to How Preschool Teachers Do It.
This is Alison Kentos. I am an early childhood educator.
And this is Cindy Tarabush. I am an early childhood consultant.
This podcast is for parents and early childhood professionals.
Let our experience and research-based knowledge become your guide. Hi, preschool peeps.
Hi, peeps.
I'm so excited about today's episode because we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. Reinvigorating your read alouds.
Yay!
Yay!
Okay.
Might be slightly mind-blowing. I don't know, because I know a lot of people have been taught to do read alouds slightly differently than we're going to discuss.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it isn't valuable. So stick with us as we blow your minds a little bit about things like how to introduce books to young children.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. As we start to discuss this, I just want us all to recall that early learners have an attention span of approximately 10 to 15 minutes.
Yes.
That's an important note when we talk about read alouds. We've got them for 10 to 15 minutes tops. And so the question becomes, how am I spending that 10 to 15 minutes?
Right.
And the way we're supposed to be spending it is to help to lay the foundation for future literacy and reading comprehension skills.
Correct. Amongst many other things, but yes, that is one of them in that 10 to 15 minute time frame. Yes.
Right. So we have to make sure of how we're spending that time.
Yeah.
I have, as a consultant and in all the positions I've held, really, I have watched many and many a book introduction. And I have some things to say about them. Imagine.
Yeah.
When I teach this during professional development sessions or conferences, and I ask people in like an anonymous participatory slide to let us know, how have you introduced books in the past? Two things generally come up. One is I talk about the author and illustrator. The other is I show them the pictures and have them guess what's going to happen. Because these are things that people are taught to do.
I was taught that in grad school, people. So that you assume that's correct if you learn that in grad school, to do the picture walk. Yep.
And it's true that one of the things that the standards tell us is that young children should understand the role of the author and the role of the illustrator.
For sure.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it has to be part of your introduction, though. So let's focus on the fact that we're trying to teach reading comprehension skills.
Yeah.
In order to do that, and in order to get children to sit for that 10 to 15 minutes for your read aloud, we have to make sure they're interested in the plot of the book. First of all, hopefully you have a book with a plot.
And the plot makes sense.
Yeah, and there's some sort of depth of character.
Yes.
Really good children's books teach important social emotional skills to children and discuss topics that are harder to discuss than just in the average conversation. Let's say.
Because children can relate to that. You know, when they see it in a book, then they could start relating to it and then talking about it, which is not always the case if you're just talking and discussing. You know, it's harder to get their feelings out that way.
We need them to care and relate to what we're reading.
Yeah.
And I want you all as adults who are listening to this episode of the podcast or watching us on YouTube to think about what you do when you encounter a book for the first time. You go to the library or to a bookstore, maybe online. And what is the first thing you do to decide, am I even interested in this book?
I just went to the library this morning. I'll tell you how I do it.
Am I even interested in this book? So you take it off the shelf
and you look at it.
And you look at what?
The cover. And then I open it and then I read the synopsis or whatever that's called.
You read the synopsis.
Yeah.
If I want to know if I'm interested in what it says in a book, my looking at the cover is very limited. I go to the I mostly look at the synopsis.
I go and then I open it up. Yeah, the summary of the book.
Yeah.
What is this book about?
What is this book? There's a book on the shelf,
about?
Right? I pick it up and I go, what is this? What did this writer write about? And so I go to either the back cover or the inside flap and I read the summary. If what the summary says poses a question in my mind or intrigues me, I'm more likely to purchase or borrow that book.
Correct.
I'm interested in it.
Otherwise, I put it right back on the shelf. If it doesn't
Correct.
pique my interest in any way, shape, or form, I'm like, you know what?
It goes right back on.
It's for somebody else, and that's okay. You know?
So when we're introducing books to children, we really need to do the same thing. We need to pique their interest in the story of the book. So we take the book and we say, today we're going to read the book. You name the book's title.
Yeah.
And you tell them a little bit, like, this book is about, give them a little bit of the plot. This book is about, and then we should pose a question and say something like, I wonder, let's read and find out.
Yeah.
Because what we're teaching children is we read to find out. That's why we always read.
Yes.
And that's the purpose of reading and the value of reading. I want children to love reading. So I have to teach them the purpose and the value of it. So just to use, I'm going to use a random children's book as an example. It's the example I use all the time. And the children's book is A Chair for My Mother. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that story, but I'm going to give you the synopsis I would give children.
Yeah.
We're going to read the book, A Chair for My Mother. A Chair for My Mother is about a family who had a fire in their house. Their favorite chair was lost in that fire, and they really miss it. I wonder if they're going to be able to get a new chair. Let's read and find out.
Yeah.
So now I have focused them on the characters and the plot. I've posed a dilemma to the children.
You posed a question that while you're reading the book to them, they're going to think about. They're not just mindlessly sitting there listening to you. They're actually now involved in the whole process because they're thinking about this question that you posed. Like, oh, wow. Like, what is going to happen? What should they do? And now they're also thinking of solutions in their own head of like, oh, this is what I would do. Like you're getting them thinking. That's the whole point, is to get them thinking while you read. Like, I don't just read a book and then just be like, whatever. I'm constantly thinking while I'm reading, what's going to happen? What would I do if I was in this situation?
And we need to focus them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to focus them on the main dilemma in the book so that they understand what it is they're even looking for or listening for. So now I know that people are listening to this episode and thinking, but what about my author illustrator thing? I do that at the end.
Yeah. Well,
I
also,
do it at the end.
I feel like there's so much focus sometimes on this author illustrator where like entire weeks will be devoted in this theme of like authors and stuff. And you're like, what? And I'm not saying that that's not amazing, that there is great authors out there and they should be recognized. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying like, it shouldn't be the main focus.
And when we say it in the beginning, we're making it the focus of our conversation. Plus, think about how many minutes out of the 10 to 15 minutes that conversation takes up, so that by the time I get into the book, I've lost time. Yeah. I've lost time to get them into the plot and the characters and the reading comprehension. Yeah. So instead, absolutely talk about authors, group your books by author, do whatever you're going to do, but talk about it at the end of the reading. For example, I will read a book, and then when I'm done with the book, I'll say to children, and that book was written by Eric Carle. Do you remember when we read other Eric Carle books? Can anybody remember another Eric Carle book? So that conversation is taking time after we've done whatever the book was about, after I've done The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Right. Then I'm going to talk about the author of that book and how we may have read other books by that author before and all that stuff, because that conversation will be more meaningful even to the children after I've read the words. Those words I just read were written by this person. Yeah. I'm not sure how we got that in early education, how we got that method flipped. I'm not quite sure. Around. Yeah. And as far as the picture walk, again, I am not trying to create guess makers necessarily. I'm trying to create readers. So what we need to do is read a book multiple times, right? So let's say I have a book and I'm going to read it 3-4 times over 2 weeks. Yeah. By the time I've read it twice, I can now show the pictures to the children and say, what is this book about? And what they're practicing when I do that is the skill of recall. Yeah. And the skill of putting a story in order.
Yes. And you as a teacher now understand, like, can figure out, did they understand what they read? So big time, like, comprehension skills there. Did they understand it? Because sometimes that's big too. Like, not just recall and matching the words to the whatever. Like, did you understand what we read? Like that's a big deal in not understanding what you read, so this is why we do read alouds, not just for entertainment value,
Right, not to take up a segment of the day. There's a lot of educational purpose to it. So we have to really intentionally think about our practices. I was in a class one time and the teacher was not doing the whole look at the cover and guess what it's about thing. She had learned to do things other ways. And she picked up the book and a child said to her, it was obviously a book having to do with Halloween. You could tell by the cover. Yeah. The teacher picked up the book and the child said, is that book about Halloween? And the teacher turned to the child and said, we're going to read to find out.
Yeah.
I loved that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, yay. Because the alternative would have been going, oh yeah, let's look at the cover for 2 to 3 minutes of your 10-minute attention span.
Yeah. And here's what I also found with picture walking before the whole reading of the book is like, now the child thinks like, oh, this book's about that because that's what I guessed it would be about. And then you read the book and it's not about what the person guessed.
Correct.
And now they're mad.
Well, I know. And now they're like, what happened to the puppy sale? What happened to the puppy sale? Well,
how come the author didn't talk about the puppy? And like, there's a puppy right there. I'm like, I don't know. That's why, to me, you already failed before you even started. Mm-hmm. You made it so that the child was not correct before you even began. And now you think they're going to listen to that book 3 times this week? No. Because it's not about the puppy.
Right. Like, so when we say to kids, when we say, what do you think this is about? We have a lovely conversation maybe, but it rarely has to actually do with the plot and the characters in the book.
Right. And I think saying, what do you think this book is about? And then afterwards saying, okay, now let's read and find out, is different than let's go through every single page of this book and you're going to guess what it says. And I feel like that's different because
no, they shouldn't be guessing what it's going to say. They should be recalling what it did
say. Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. Now that everyone is sitting there like, oh, wow. Okay. Author and illustrator at the end, picture walk as a tool for memory. Okay.
Yes. Not predicting. Yeah. Memory. Yeah.
When we do that, by the way, when we say to them, okay, we've heard this book, and you have to own it right in the beginning. And you have to say, we're going to be looking at this book again.
Yeah.
But I'm going to ask you after a couple of times or a few times that we've read it, I'm going to ask you all to tell me the story. That's another skill that we're strengthening. It's their narrative skills. Yeah. We need to help children with their narrative skills as part of literacy.
Yeah.
So when I have a story that they basically already know and they can repeat it, kind of like my kids repeated Goodnight Moon forever, thought they were reading, they were not, they were too young, but we could go through that book and they could tell me the story. As much as that sometimes drives families crazy, it's an important narrative skill.
Yeah, it is.
So you got to let them do it. They're practicing being narrative and narration and telling stories and telling stories in a logical order. Because if you've ever heard the story of your average, 2, 3, 4-year-old, they're not always in a logical order. So this gives them practice. Gives them practice in doing this and not just kind of going off everywhere. They'll understand that a story.
Things.
There's a sequence. And
this is with the story. Yeah.
We've had some fun conversations with children about stories, obviously. So while you're reading, by the way, there's lots of words and phrases in there that children don't know.
Yeah.
You have to make sure to pre-read your books.
Yeah.
Figure out what these children might not know, what it means. And then you're going to have to define it for them as you read. Just like when you were reading, if you come across the word, let's say you're reading and you come across a phrase or a word that you don't know, and you just sort of keep going. You lose meaning of other parts of what you're reading. We can't just keep going. We have to figure out what they might not know and help them understand it by rephrasing it.
And it builds their vocabulary to do that. Like you shouldn't just be picking books that you're like, oh, well, they're not going to know where this word is, so I'm not going to pick that book. It's like, no, pick that book, but then explain what that word means, and then you'll build their vocabulary. And then you have these little people who are using these big words sometimes because they've read it in a book and they understand what it means, so. Yeah.
And then as you're doing that, as you're going along, you really should be asking them questions that relate back to that summary you gave them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ask as you read, ask after you read, Answering and asking questions about what we've read is going to be an important skill as they get older in school.
Yeah.
I still do it in the work that I do as a learner. I have to read and answer questions. So, let's get them started doing that, but based on the characters and the plot in the book.
Yeah.
Right. So far, this episode has been focused on, I guess, fictional books, stories.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'd like to give a shout out to nonfiction books.
Nonfiction books.
Okay. So we need to make sure that we have nonfiction books in our classrooms that are on the topics that are of interest to children and relate to their real lives outside of your setting. Like if you have kids who love to explore parks and go on walks with their families, you need books about parks. You need books to inspire children around your classroom, nonfiction books. There definitely should be nonfiction books all over the place, but they aren't read to children in the same way that fictional books are.
Yeah, that's different. That's
nonfiction is like, you don't read it cover to cover like you do a fictional book.
No, you kind of are almost like read the parts that you're interested in at the time. Like you're answering questions, like you form your question, or like say your book is about flowers and you're like, I want to understand how the seed will turn into, to start grow and the stem happens. You're like, okay, well, let's find that page of the book, and now I answered your question. And then like tomorrow, the question might be something different. Okay, let's go to our nonfiction books. It's not something that you would read at meeting time from cover to cover.
Right.
You're going to lose them, but they are good references, like if you're learning about butterflies and you want to learn about the chrysalis of a butterfly,
go to that page.
Go to that page, And that might have been prompted by some of these fiction butterfly books. But if you want the actual stuff, then you need to go to a nonfiction book. Here's what a real chrysalis looks like. It's what a real caterpillar does. You know what I mean? That's what those nonfiction books, they can back up all the stuff that you're learning.
You mean they're not all the very hungry caterpillar? Is that what you're trying to tell me? They're not eating their way through all the fruit?
Cindy, you don't want to get me started on that book.
Because I actually like that book.
It's so scientifically inaccurate, though.
Okay, that's true, but it's also fiction. Listen, I watched a based on real life movie yesterday, also primarily fiction.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
Yeah.
I like to think it was real, but no.
If you're reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar, I think you also need to discuss afterwards that this is a work of fiction and caterpillars don't eat this.
I think that could be a question. I think you can say to the children, do you really think caterpillars eat this stuff? And they're going to be like, no. Most of them will be like, no. And then when you go, that's right. It's just a fun story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
He also doesn't use the correct term for chrysalis.
Boy, are you picky?
It's the scientist in me. Yeah, I am very picky. I won't even read that book anymore because it's so scientifically inaccurate.
Allison. Yeah. All right. Well,
because there's so many other books about butterflies and caterpillars that are accurate.
Allison, I wouldn't have mentioned it if I knew you felt so strongly.
I feel very strongly about that one.
We're gonna agree to disagree about that book.
Agree to disagree about that one because that's one of them that I just can't do. I think it promotes really good
recall.
It could, sure.
I think that the recall is what that book is really about.
Yeah.
But okay, we'll get her off her rant, I promise. When we're looking at nonfiction, I often compare it when I do trainings about it. I compare it to when the old days, the before times, the olden days, when we used to use encyclopedias.
That's right. I forgot all about encyclopedias. But yes, that's true.
What did we do? We had a particular question in mind or thing we had to research. I didn't pick up the volume that was like all of A and read all of A. I went to what I needed to know. And that's also how we read nonfiction with children. If your nonfiction books in your classroom don't have a table of contents, please get some that have a table of contents.
Yes.
It's a great way to teach children how to use the table of contents. Let's say the book, I'm almost afraid to say a book now. Let's say the book is about oceans and the child is interested in the shells in the ocean. And there's a portion of that book that has that in the table of contents. What I would do is I would take the child to the table of contents first, show the child, oh, look, this says all about shells on page 10. Let's go to page 10. And I would be teaching the child how to use the table of contents.
Yeah.
Another important lesson.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've given people a lot of food for thought about reinvigorating their read alouds.
Yeah.
I hope.
I hope so.
If you have feedback about this,
Oh,
not necessarily about the debate over the one book, but if you have feedback about the process of read alouds,
yes,
or something you've tried that you feel like really works, send it to us with your name and where you are and permission to say it on the podcast if you would like it to be said, or give us permission to say it on the podcast. We love sharing feedback, and that's why we instituted the Feedback 5. Yeah. So we are actually going to go to the Feedback 5 now. I have to bring up the feedback that we're going to share on my screen in front of me. Hang on one sec. Okay. So we received feedback about the show and tell episode again. I have to tell you, we've gotten a lot of feedback about that.
We have. I feel like a lot of our feedback lately has been about the show and tell. So if you missed that episode, go back a couple. It's really good.
Yes.
Yeah.
The show and tell episode garnered a lot of comment.
Yeah.
Positive and good comment.
Yes.
And people sharing what they have done or not done. So I'm going to share right now as part of our Feedback 5, Jill Gorham Yowell. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Jill.
Yeah. Hi, Jill.
Jill wrote to us about the show and tell episode. She said that it gave her a lot of food for thought, and she hadn't even considered regarding that tradition, and she's going to think about it, which is great. But here's what she shared that we wanted to share with all of you. She decided this year to do away with the weather chart during circle time. Yay! Yay! You go, Jill. You go. Jill said she found the children were bored and restless as they watched the child who was the weather reporter chart the weather for the day. And she decided that she could use that same number of minutes, like between 5 and 10 minutes, to work on things like skills or games.
Who would have thought?
Or relevant social emotional learning.
Yeah.
Jill thought it. And so kudos to you, Jill. And thank you for sharing that with us so that we knew to share it with everybody. Yeah. Yes, please. The weather is best talked about when, Alison?
Outside.
Thank you. Or at least by a window or a door if you can't go all the way outside. Yeah. Let's say it's like torrential rain or...
Yeah, so you go to the window and you look.
Yes.
Yeah. You know?
Please. Large
as it's happening, not like dedicating 5 minutes of your large group time to weather that they experience on their walk-ins to school. It's just not necessary.
It should be a way more casual conversation at some other point of the day. The purpose of your large group time is to remind children that they're part of a group. That's it. It isn't to be meteorologists. If we want them to talk about the weather, they need to be near the weather, and they need to be doing it casually so that it feels like more of a conversation and less of an assignment.
Yes.
Also, I appreciate that Jill recognized that it's taking up time that could be done doing social, emotional, and other skill building, because that's just the truth.
So true. We just talked in the beginning of this episode that you only have like 10 to 15 minutes of attention span time here.
That's right.
Why are you wasting 5 of it for one child to go report the weather when you could be using it on anything else that builds skills? Yeah. So
once again, thank you, Jill, for bringing that out to the forefront. That whole, here's what I've changed, and kudos to you for changing it.
Yeah.
And I hope that everybody now thinks about 2 things after this episode. One is, I have to introduce my books differently maybe, and use the picture walk for a different purpose, and do nonfiction books differently. And the other one is, I don't absolutely have to do that whole weather thing during large group time. And in fact, it's taking up important skill building and socialization time.
Yeah. I feel like that kind of throws back to one of our very original episodes, which was rethinking circle time.
That's an oldie but a goodie.
That's pre-YouTube us. That's an oldie but goodie. That was like 2 years ago. If you want to go, you can only listen to it because we weren't recording on YouTube then, but go for it. And then you can learn all about the things that you should and should not do at your meeting times.
Correct.
I think it was a twofer actually. What not to do at circle time and what to do in circle time. So go find those back from like 2017 or something.
Right.
Like that. Yeah. See, it all comes around again.
There you go. And there you have it, folks.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to let you go ponder all that.
Yeah.
And we will catch you next time on the podcast.
Bye, peeps.
Bye, everybody.